you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me one quick favor, see that little black subscribe button on the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Really does help this channel grow, my audience grow, and I appreciate it more than you know. Also, quick thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet $50 on any game. Get up to $1,111 in free bets courtesy of the Betfred Sportsbook. Thank you again. Now, here's the video that you came here for. And the topic of the day, listen, it's obviously this never-ending hamster wheel of realignment. And I apologize, we do it every day, but there's a new twist every day. And to explain the new twist from Wednesday, I want to tell you a little bit about a personality quirk of mine that might help explain why I'm talking about this so much and what is relevant from Wednesday. That personality quirk about me is this. Even though I'm not a journalist, I don't consider myself a journalist, a big J. I like trying to figure out stuff. I like trying to figure out, take a bunch of puzzle pieces that seemingly don't fit and make them all fit together. I've told my wife many times, in another world, I think I would have liked to have been a police investigator, right? Go to the crime scene. What does this mean? What does that mean? You know, I watch 2020 and I watch all these Netflix reality shows. And you sit there and say, okay, why did the husband say that? Why did she do that? What does that mean? Does that mean anything? Like, I'm that guy. I'm kind of annoying to watch these criminal documentaries about, but that's my personality trait. And so I bring it up because when it comes to this conference realignment stuff, listen, I think I've done as good a job as anybody covering it. But what I would also say is if you listen to this show consistently, I have said there is one piece of the puzzle I just don't get. I get why Colorado wants to go to the Big 12. I get why the Big 12 might stay at 14, take Arizona. I get why they might stay at 16. I get why Arizona wants to do this. I get even why a Utah and an Arizona State might want to stay in the Pac-12. I get why a UConn, a Gonzaga, somebody from outside would want to get into the Big 12. The one piece of the puzzle that I could not figure out over the last couple months was this. Why are Washington and Oregon seemingly just having zero interest in the Big 12? And it was funny, if you listen to Wednesday's show, I said it's like playing poker against somebody where you have the best hand, where you literally know you have the best hand, and the other person just keeps check raising you all the time. And you're like, is there a better hand than a royal flush? And that was what I felt like with Oregon and Washington for the last couple of weeks. Do they know something we don't know? Well, on Wednesday, we got the answer to that question, and here's why. It is because Dan Wetzel from Yahoo, longtime college sports reporter, he was the first one to report that now the Big Ten is actively pursuing expansion, and that the Big Ten would consider going from 16 teams next year, UCLA and USC are, of course, joining, to potentially 18 and adding Washington and Oregon, or they could even go to 20 and add Washington and Oregon and Cal and Stanford. And so there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot to discuss. But if this was the police documentary on Netflix, this would be the part where I jump out of my seat and knock books off the shelf, because now it all makes sense. It all makes sense as to why Washington and Oregon have been playing it so cool. Now, in terms of the specifics, listen, what I would say is not only according to Wetzel, but everyone that I talk to and other reporters that I've read throughout the day, this is a very fluid situation. And it could move very fast and it could move very slow. And the Big Ten is in the very early stages of exploring this expansion topic. Part of it, bluntly, comes down to what does the Big 12 do going forward? If the Big 12 stays, first of all, if the Big 12 completely whiffs on the Pac-12, I don't think the Big Ten is going to raid the Pac-12 for Oregon and Washington or anybody else. If the Big 12 just goes to 14 instead of 16, does it make it less likely? We would find that out. Now, if the Big 12 goes to 16 and adds Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah, does it make it more likely? There are other factors as well. Again, do you go to 16 or do you go to 18 or do you go to 20? Excuse me. What do your TV partners want? There has to be more money in it. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for the school presidents in the Big Ten to approve it. Again, expansion is not a charity thing. They're not doing it to help UCLA and USC so they have better travel partners. They would be doing it if it makes them more money. So is there a TV partner that's willing to pay those schools to become part of what they do? By the way, I just mentioned it. What do USC and UCLA want? We heard that USC was very adamant early on that they and UCLA were going to be the only two West Coast schools. Well, Mike Bone, the former USC athletic director, is gone. Has that changed? By the way, do you want to expand too quickly? Because who knows what's going to happen with the ACC? And if you grab a bunch of Pac-12 teams, it leaves you maybe on the outside looking in if a North Carolina becomes available, if a Virginia becomes available, somebody like that. So there are a million moving parts. But I guess what I would say, if I have two broad theses about this, one, I'm ultimately not surprised. And two, for the first time, I really don't know what's going to happen next. Now, from the I'm not surprised perspective, again, it goes back to what I said to lead this segment. All along, Oregon and Washington have played it cool. All along, Oregon and Washington have had zero interest in the Big 12. I never fully understood why. But I guess what I would say is it does come back to something that I talked about on this show probably about 3 or so weeks ago, maybe a week ago. All these conversations are running together. But I had an interesting conversation with somebody plugged in West Coast football probably, a month or so ago. And I remember I just asked him, I said, I can't put this Oregon-Washington puzzle piece together. And what he told me is bluntly, he's like, look, Oregon and Washington are not going to the Big 12. They have no interest. And really, it's all about Phil Knight, right? Like Phil Knight, you can say this guy's the athletic director at Oregon. This guy's the school president. Dan Lanning is the football coach. Phil Knight is the guy who runs the athletic department in that university. And he's the one that's calling all the shots. And the Big Ten is what he has wanted since the day that USC and UCLA have left. Now, at the time, it might not have been an option, but stuff has changed. And what I was told was whether it was waiting it out in the Pac-12, whether it was buying his way into the Big Ten, whatever it was going to take, he wasn't going to the Big 12. And the bottom line was he was, he was willing to, whether it comes down to taking a partial TV share, so not getting the same as the other 16 Big Ten schools going forward. If it meant staying in the Pac-12 and basically subsidizing the athletic department for a couple years, so the Pac-12 is only making $20 million, but we can have a short-term deal that gets us to the Big Ten faster when they do decide to expand, we'll do that. But I'm not surprised because that was the only logical explanation, was that Phil Knight wanted the Big Ten and that Phil Knight was going to make the Big Ten happen through hell or high water. So I'm not surprised from Oregon and Washington because, again, every action that they have had for the last couple months has indicated that the Big 12 was not an option. And I don't think anybody really felt like staying in the Pac-12 was a realistic option either. Now, from the Stanford-Cal perspective, that's a whole nother, ball of wax. And what I will tell you, and I do find this part interesting, I remember very early on, shortly after UCLA and USC left, I remember talking to somebody at Stanford. And what he told me, he was like, dude, we really ain't worried. He's like, everybody's focused on Oregon and Washington. He's like, we feel pretty good that if the Big Ten goes beyond 16 teams, that we're going to be the second call behind Notre Dame. And again, at that time, they were tied to Notre Dame. But his argument was essentially the Big Ten, listen, we think of it as football brands in Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and Wisconsin. The Big Ten, ultimately, as we remember from COVID, it is a group of academics that consider themselves superior to everybody else, and they want to rub elbows with the Stanford people. And so what I can tell you is my Stanford guys were like, we feel pretty good that whenever they expand, they're going to want us, because in the same way that maybe a Ryan Day or a Jim Harbaugh wants to compete against Oregon and Washington, the school presidents, they want to rub elbows with whoever's running Stanford right now. So Stanford to me makes sense. Cal a little bit less, but you got to get to 20. You got to get an even number. I do think if Notre Dame somehow said, you know what, we're in, Cal, you got to get the heck out of here, which could be a factor as well. I don't think Notre Dame is interested even now in joining a league. But the one thing I will say is this stuff is fluid. And the one thing that stands out to me, I can sit there and say that all throughout this stretch, I feel like I've had a pretty good pulse on what is going on. Said for months, Colorado was going to be the first one to defect. Now, I did say, is it UConn next? Is it Arizona next? But I said from there, I think Arizona, realistically is probably the next school. But what I will also say is that up until literally Wednesday afternoon when this story broke, I've been adamant that I don't know if the Big 12 wants the four corner schools. I know they like Arizona to go to 14. I've never believed that they wanted Arizona State and Utah. But has that changed? If the Big 10 goes to 20, are you being left behind sticking with 14, excuse me, if you're the Big 12? From Utah and Arizona State's perspective, those were the two schools, in my opinion, that were most adamant about making the Pac-12 work. But are they now looking at the landscape and saying there's nothing to salvage here? Everybody else, Colorado's already out. USC and UCLA are out. Arizona's looking out the side door. Oregon and Washington are looking out the side door. So now are Utah and Arizona State more interested? By the way, the inverse is true too. Is the Big 12 actually interested in them? I've heard mixed things. What did I just say about Notre Dame? Notre Dame has been adamant since the beginning of all this. We want to stay independent. We want to have our own thing. We want to have our own TV deal. Do they want to be left out in a world of 3 to 4 major conferences for as long as the ACC holds tight? Do they want to be left out? Now, all of a sudden, what happens when the Big 10 is playing 9 to 10 league games? And you're not going to be able to just schedule Stanford or USC or Michigan or whomever whenever you want. By the way, I just mentioned it. What about the ACC? There's now rumors that Florida State is actively trying to get out of that grant of rights deal. Now, I think it's harder than people realize. Everybody says, oh, there's great lawyers. They have great lawyers. Yeah, you know who put together that grant of rights deal? Great lawyers 10 years ago. So what I can definitively say is that for the first time in this whole process, as I record, what is this, about 8:15 on Wednesday night? This is the first time I can definitively say I really, actually do not know what the next steps are, because I think there's so much to be figured out. Who goes to the Big 12 and how fast? If nobody goes, does the Big 10 then back off and say, you know what, we're not going to be the ones that break up the Pac-12, sign a short-term deal, we'll get back to you in a few years? If one school leaves the Big 12, is that enough leaves the Pac-12 for the Big 12, I should say? Is that enough for the Big 10 to pounce? Again, what about the ACC? Again, do you want to expand too fast if you're the Big 10, if other schools may become available soon? So the one thing I can definitively say, man, the landscape, like this stuff is changing. Forget by the day. It's changing by the hour. And for the first time, I can definitively say, I don't know what's next. The one thing I do know, everybody's looking out for themselves. And other than that, all I can say is college sports is changing in front of our eyes. I can't tell you what the landscape's going to look like in, 2024, a year from now. Can't tell you what it's going to look like. The latest, of course, again, Dan Wetzel, Oregon and Washington have begun exploratory conversations with the Pac-12 or the Big 10. Cal and Stanford maybe as well.